The lady had always sat in her pew, every Sunday, for years, but not this Sunday. On this Sunday, as the preacher was leaving the auditorium, he noticed that the lady was sitting in a chair just outside the auditorium. He asked if she was okay, and she answered emphatically, no. He inquired, asking her what was wrong, and that's when she poured out her heart to him. She said, I have been here for years. Nobody pays attention to me. Nobody really knows me. In this church, nobody cares. The preacher responded to her and he said, you're wrong. She looked right back at him and said, I'm right. Now, the timing of this conversation was awkward at best. The preacher had to keep moving, but he left her with this heartfelt message. As he just simply told her, he said, I've got to go, but you have to hear me, and you have to know this. You're wrong. In this church, people care. And as he walked away, her voice trailed right behind him as she responded, I'm not. In this church, nobody cares. Friends, I hear that statement and I think about over times when people may have made that statement about our church, our congregation. It's likely happened. In this church, nobody cares. But here's what I hope. I hope that over time that people will give us an opportunity to prove that statement to be wrong. And I pray that we are successful at that. I hear that statement, in this church, nobody cares. And I'm reminded of the Good Samaritan. I'm reminded of that story of the man going down the road and he was robbed, beaten, and left half dead. But it was the priest and the Levite, the religious people, who passed him by. It was the Good Samaritan that stopped and bandaged his wounds and took care of him. But I wonder if people had asked, the priest and the Levite, are these good men or are these bad men? It really would just depend who you asked. But I hope that we live our lives in such a way of striving to do good for all people, that people will look at our church and declare, that church cares. Our title this morning for our lesson is Cultivating Compassion. This is one of those sermons that just needs to be preached on a regular basis. I think about this idea of planting a garden. And when we plant a garden, what is it that we have to do? We have to turn some soil, and that's what we're going to do today. We're going to turn some soil because we know at times as we evaluate our heart, we evaluate our lives individually and as a church, that we need to add fertilizer, we need to add water, we need to pull some weeds because our goal is to have a good harvest. And so that's what we hope to do today as we look at this idea of cultivating compassion. Now, as we begin, I hope that we understand this, that God has a special place in His heart for the hurting. As we look today, we're going to see a lot of different terms. God has a special place in His heart for the underdog, the outcast, the brokenhearted. I'm reminded of Psalm 34, verse 18, where it's there that Scripture tells us, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Psalm 147, verse 3 tells us, He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. Now, both times, the passage points to God's love for those who are hurting. But there's another psalm I want us to see, and this is Psalm 109, verse 16. Because in this passage, David is talking about his enemies. And look how he describes his enemies. For he never thought of doing a kindness, but hounded to death the poor, the needy, and the brokenhearted. Now there's a key verse for us right here, because again, we're looking at a lot of different words that are going to come together today as we're reminded of people that want to cultivate compassion. These are the people that we need to make sure we keep before us. And here David has used the three words, the poor, the needy, and the brokenhearted. And so we want to keep that verse before us because of those phrases, those words, and how beneficial they're going to be for us. If you're looking for a memory verse for today, we have one of those every Sunday. Today's memory verse is Proverbs chapter 14, verse 31. It's there that the wise man writes, "Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their Maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God." Now I want us to unpack this verse. This is another verse that is a two-part verse. It has the first half of this verse, "Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their Maker." That is a negative statement. It points to the people who fail to do good. But then on the second half of the verse, there is this mention of the blessing that comes to those who do good, who have cultivated and now demonstrate compassion. It's interesting as we look. I want us to look at a couple of words here. The word oppresses. That's a word that gets used, but I want to make sure that we have a good understanding of that word, that we have a good meaning for that word. All right, so we think about this idea of oppresses the poor. Oppression is a big word. It means pressing down, defrauding, violent acts, deceitful acts, extortion, or simply doing people wrong. And so when we think about oppressing, we're thinking about taking advantage of other people. And that's where the proverb says, "Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for the Lord." And we want to make sure that we're aware of that. Then there's the word that is used for poor. Now, the New International Version and the New American Standard use two different words. First half of the verse is the word poor. Second half is the word needy. Those are good translations because the original words in Hebrew are not the same words. And we want to make sure that we're aware of that. The word for poor in the first part of this verse means low, poor, weak, thin, one who is low. Now, the person who oppresses the poor shows contempt for God. That's not difficult to understand, is it? When we mistreat someone, we show contempt for God. We dishonor Him. We disgrace Him. We insult Him. And the way that we treat the poor shows the respect that we have for God. So those that are downtrodden would be another good word to keep for us. This is how God feels when we mistreat another human being, someone that's made in the image of God. Now, so everything I've just said, the first half of that verse, "Whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their Maker." That's the negative. You can look at almost the exact opposite of that, because that's how God feels for the person who does good for those that are hurting. The person who is kind to the needy. Now we're digging into words here, so the word for needy down at the bottom, remember it is actually a different word. This word points to a person in want, someone who is abused, someone who needs help, or someone who is in trouble. As you can tell, both of these words, poor and needy, are really very general terms for people who are in a time of need. We really would be talking, though, about people that are in a lower class of society. And so God is looking, He's looking to see how we treat people in their time of need. Be kind to those who are hurting and suffering. Those that are hurting and suffering, we're kind to them. The Bible says we honor God. You see, we want to be a church who cares. And in being that church who cares, we honor God. Let's look at some more words of wisdom, shall we? Proverbs 19, verse 17. "Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and He will reward them for what they have done. When it comes to parenting, I've never been a fan of bribing. You know what I'm talking about, right? Be good and I'll give you $5. Be good while we're in the restaurant, I'll give you $5. I'll buy you a new toy. Or if you'll do this or around the house, I'll give you $10. That's just never been the way we've operated in our home. I'm just not a fan. Now, here's why I bring that up. Because there are preachers that would look at this verse and it would be like that parent that's bribing their child. It's whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and He will reward him for what they have done. And some preachers will say, if you want to get rich quick, the best thing you can do is go be kind and lend and give to the poor. Give to some worthy cause, and the Lord will turn right around and bless you financially. Friends, I think that's an abuse of this verse. I think that we need to open up our understanding to see that that blessing can come in all forms and fashions. Man, when God blesses us, it doesn't have to be with a fat bank account. Sometimes that blessing is a peace of the soul. Sometimes that blessing is a joy of the heart. A wise man once put it this way: to know that one other life has benefited because you have lived, that is to have succeeded. The reward, the blessing is real. Friends, we want to be a people. We want to be a church who cares. We want to be a church who cares. Same idea. Proverbs 22 verse 9. The generous will themselves be blessed, for they share their food with the poor. Proverbs 14 verse 21 tells us, it is a sin to despise one's neighbor, but blessed is the one who is kind to the needy. Again, I keep re-emphasizing that when we look at this idea of blessing, remember, this can be a peace of the soul, a joy of the heart. There are blessings that come in all forms and fashions as God blesses His people for being a church who cares. Man, I love the principle here. Blessed is the one who is kind to the needy. We don't just help when it's easy. We live a life of generosity to others. That's why I think it's important today when we start talking about cultivating our lives for compassion, cultivating compassion, we start talking about turning up the soil. It's so that we can reap a harvest of goodness and righteousness and compassion. This is a long-term life commitment. This is not just some flash pan idea that we want to be kind for the next week. We want to be a people of compassion. We want to be a church who cares. And we want that to be a life statement about us, whether it's individually or as a church. Now, when we're talking about turning up some soil, let's get practical with that idea, because what I hope that we can do today is to see that people who care have eyes, have hands, and have hearts of compassion. Let's begin with the people who care, have eyes of compassion. Proverbs 28 verse 27 says, those who give to the poor will lack nothing, but those who close their eyes to them receive many curses. That's when I think back to that parable of the Good Samaritan, and I think of the priest and the Levite. They closed their eyes to those who were in hurt. They closed their eyes to the man who was left on the side of the road. We don't want to do that. Author Bill Hybels makes a great point. He says, every person I know who has a heart of compassion can describe in graphic terms the specific time and place when his or her eyes were opened to the needs of the poor. I read that statement and I thought back of my own life. I have a special place in my heart for residents of nursing homes. And I think of how that care was cultivated over the years. I can't remember the first time that it hit me. And it's because I was brought up from as early as I remember of going to visit people at nursing homes. Whether that was a family member or whether it was a member of our church family, whether it was a neighbor, whether it was somebody from our community. My parents brought me up in a way that going to our local nursing homes was just something I did. When our church hosted a devotional once a month, by the way, that church still hosts that devotional once a month. Not right now, but it is part of their regular calendar and has been up right up to this point of the pandemic. But what they did is for every month. Now that means that that tradition, if you will, is well over 40 or 50 years old now. What a great statement for a church. But see, that helped cultivate a heart of compassion for me because I look and I am aware. I see the needs of the elderly, and that stirs my heart. It turns the soil of my heart because I don't close my eyes to the concern of the elderly. Man, what a great memory, and I hope that you have a memory similar to that you can share. Over the years, I've been involved with dozens of house painting projects. As a youth minister, we'd often go and we would paint a house in a neighborhood or a number of houses. I thought that was a good lesson that needed to be shared. Parents would often put it this way with me, is that our children need to be reminded that everybody doesn't have it as good as we do. But I remember one house where it really became personal for me. It was the house of an older couple. They were grandparents, and they had just received temporary custody of their grandchildren. The mom and dad were just not in a good place. Not in a good place to care and rear those children. And so the state and the court had stepped in and given those grandparents temporary custody. They were good people. But this custody was going to be a battle. And I found out why as we painted that home. It was because of the overall state and condition of that home. So we were able to make some repairs along the way and able to paint that home. And, we finished and we got through and we left, we went about our way. But when I found out later that one of the main reasons that the judge gave permanent custody to those grandparents was because of the improvements made to that home, it hit me that our awareness, opening our eyes to the needs of others, we can do things that end up being so much of a greater blessing than we would have ever thought or imagined. And so now it's important to me to be able to look and to recognize the needs of others. I remember working with doctors and dentists in the country of Guatemala. I took a number of medical mission trips. I served as the chaplain for those trips because that's about all of the medical knowledge that I have. But I remember sitting next to them and I would help, whether it was to take vital signs or whether it was an assistant to a dentist. But I realized how blessed we are in our country. There was one particular village, and as we came to that village, one of the local members of that village came up to the person heading our particular effort and expressed a need that they had. There was an older lady that was on her deathbed. And they asked if we would come and participate in the funeral for her. And they asked me to speak. She was still alive. But they knew that there would not be a preacher as she would pass away. And so they asked if we would join us for a time of celebration of her life. And so I spoke, and it was translated into their native language. I was reminded of how blessed we are to have people who care. And that at times when things go great, we want to rejoice with those who rejoice. But I'm reminded at those extremely difficult moments in life, particularly at the end of journey in a time of sickness and declining health, of how important it is for us to be there at a time when people hurt, and to be there at a time to be a blessing for those families. Now, those are just a few of my stories, and here's the thing. I can only tell you my stories. And so we have to pause, and I have to ask you to take some time after this lesson, after our worship, to go back and to think of those stories that have impacted you. At times when your eyes were opened and you saw the challenges and the needs of others, and it has impacted of how you show compassion to others today. And I pray that today those memories will will cultivate our hearts. You know, it's one thing for us to see the need. It's another thing for us to do something about it. And that's where we need to be a people who have hands of compassion. Proverbs chapter 31, verse 20 is a verse very familiar to us. We're talking about the woman, the wife of noble character. It's a beautiful verse. Look at one of the traits that describe her. Proverbs 31:20 says, "She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy." What a beautiful description of a godly woman. But I have to tell you that that same idea should be a statement that describes all of us. Husband, wife, mother, father, child, Christian. That should describe all of us. And then I'm reminded of these words. These are from the New Testament. 1 John chapter 3, verses 16 through 18. Really the only New Testament verses we'll read today. It is because they are that strong. That's why I wanted to bring them before us. 1 John 3:16. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down His life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truths. If we are going to be a church who cares, then we need to be a people who don't just talk a good talk. We need to put our faith into action. This is why I love to watch members who serve. And let me explain, whether it's picking up a pen to write a note, whether it's picking up a phone to make that call, whether it's stopping by to see if there's a need, whether it's making a meal and sharing that with a family during a difficult time. I love watching people that put their Christianity into action, that put their faith into action. And that's what we want to do today. Given today's environment, there are so many people that are lonely, are isolated. That's why I think of just the beauty of that simple text, that card, that phone call. There are so many things we can do today to be a blessing in the lives of others. And yes, that is putting our faith into action. And yes, that is showing others that we are a church who cares. Now, we've turned a lot of soil and we've used this word throughout our lesson, because if we have eyes of compassion, it leads us to be hands of compassion. That shows ultimately, friends, that we have hearts of compassion. This is where that single act becomes a habit. Being kind to those in need isn't something we just do when it's convenient. It's not just something we do when we've heard a sermon on this topic. It's who we are. And that's where we come back to a verse that we've looked at before in this series. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. A powerful statement, my friends, as a reminder to us that we always want to watch and evaluate and check up the condition of our heart. We need to make sure, as Jesus used that parable of the sower in Mark chapter 4, that we want to make sure that we have fertile soil in our hearts, that we're listening to the Word of God and we're allowing it to take root and to grow so that there can be a beautiful harvest that comes because we are a people who have hearts of compassion. I want to leave us with two simple challenges today, if I can. If we want to be this people that are cultivating the soil of our hearts, then the first thing that we need to do is we need to turn to Jesus. And here's why that's important. Because Jesus, in His life and in His ministry, He looked out for the needy, the outcast, the brokenhearted, those in their time of need. Just read through the Gospels. That's who Jesus regularly spent time with. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus is the one that has set that example for us. So if we want to be a people who cultivate compassion, then we need to look to Jesus as that ultimate example and let Him set that pace. Let Him show us the way so that we can do that. And it may be that you haven't yet made that ultimate decision to follow Jesus. You see, this is part of really what we're talking about. We're making a decision to follow Jesus, that Jesus, we're going to treat others the way that you treated others. We're going to forgive others the way that you forgave others. And we want to proclaim the good news because we want to bring people to you. And so if today you need to make that statement that Jesus is Lord of your life and you need to be baptized for the forgiveness of sins, then I hope that is a decision that weighs heavily on your heart, and that you would make that decision. You would reach out to us and let us help you in that effort to come to Christ, to make the statement that Jesus Christ is Lord, and to follow Him. One more practical step, if I can suggest this. If we want to be a people who cultivate compassion, then we need to look for others who have eyes of compassion, hands of compassion, and hearts of compassion. In other words, we want to look for others that are living their lives that way, and we want to walk with them so that we can learn from them. I'm reminded of Proverbs 13, verse 20. If you will remember that, the verse there talked about that if we want to be wise, then we need to walk with the wise. And I hope that we will do that we will be today challenged to be a people who cultivate compassion, that we have eyes of compassion. We do not turn away from people in a time of need. We do not turn our eyes away. We look at them. But it's not just looking, it's wanting to put our faith into action. And so we reach out our hands to do some good, to be a people who act upon this idea of caring for others. And ultimately that means that we have hearts of compassion, because we know that everything we do ultimately begins with those good decisions that are made in the heart.